Welcome to this special edition of the Journey Home program. We're here in the library at Littlemore, where Newman spent the last 4 years of his spiritual journey before he entered into the Catholic faith. And we're in the library where, in fact, he studied, went through that time of discernment. And as we mentioned in an earlier program, not far behind us here in the library is the very desk that he wrote one of his most famous books, the Essay on the Development of Doctrine. And we're here interviewing English converts. And I have with me here today as a guest, Professor Paul Williams. He is Professor of Indian and Tibetan Philosophy and head of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Bristol here in the UK. He is going to tell us about his journey of faith, and it has many stages, which are very fascinating. And so, Paul, I welcome you to this program. It's great to have you here. You've just recently, right, put out released a book that describes in more detail your journey.
Yes, indeed. I've released a book called The Unexpected Way, which is, I suppose, what it was. It was unexpected, as so often, and as was the case.
Although you had another title at first.
Yes, I wanted to call it Out of My Head, which is actually what everyone said I was, but the publishers here in the UK thought it was too hippie.
All right. Well, normally we begin the story. It's good for people to know where you've come from. So why don't you share a bit of your spiritual background? And since you went through many stages, please feel free to give us all the details. Okay. Where'd you begin? Well, in fact, where you're from here in the United States?
I'm actually from a town called Exeter, which is one of the main towns in the southwest of England. And I was brought up an Anglican, and in fact I was actually quite an involved Anglican. I went to church very regularly. I was in the church choir, and I actually ended as a head chorister. And it's quite amusing, really, because my voice broke when I was quite young, and I'd finally made it to head chorister at the very same time as my voice broke. So I spent my entire time as head chorister miming, which I think probably gave me an early taste of the bluff needed for the career of an academic. Anyway, I was an Anglican for many years, and
can I ask you a question here?
Yeah.
Just to clarify, in terms of those early years as an Anglican, would it have been an experience of faith or more culture in the Anglican ambiance of your upbringing?
Do you mean in the sense of, did I feel a very strong commitment, or was it just part of the family?
Yes.
Difficult to say when we're talking about someone. I mean, I first joined the church choir when I was 5, I think. So we're talking about between the age of 5 and 16. I don't know. It was both in a way, although I have to say that my immediate family weren't particularly churchgoers, although my brothers did join the church choir. But for me, I loved singing church music. We went to one of those wonderful English parish churches, actually dated back to Saxon times. So I had history all around me. I loved the music. And I would, because I was in the choir, I would go to church morning and evening on a Sunday, and weddings and things like that, for which we got paid extra, and absolutely loved it. And I was totally brought up with church music and with the Anglican, very traditional village Anglican ambiance. We moved around a bit when I was young. My mother died when I was quite young, which I think might be an element in the story in a way. And I began to drift away from the Anglican Church around about when I was about 16. I'm talking now about the mid-60s.
Right.
So
it was a time of a lot of drifting.
It was a time of a lot of drifting. Here in this country, we had public examinations, and I was expected to do well. I grew long hair and dressed strangely, and I got interested in meditation and that sort of thing. But I no longer went to church. It drifted away. But academically, I was still interested in religion and philosophy and that sort of thing, but I was no longer practicing as an Anglican.
When you actually went in then, therefore, we Americans our system of education is a bit different, high school, college, and then graduate degree, and I know it's a bit different here. So you take your exams, and then you head off, let's say, at that point to Oxford or a school in between?
Here in this country, I took my exams, and that's what we call the end of the school system, and then you go on to university. And actually didn't go to Oxford to do my first degree. I did my doctorate at Oxford. But I did my first degree. I went up to university, to a place called the University of Sussex, which is on the south coast in England, to read originally philosophy. I was actually very interested in philosophical ideas, in real heavy, hardcore philosophy. But by pure chance, really, I think it was chance, maybe it wasn't, but anyway, it's sort of chance, I found myself at the only university in this country at that time where you could actually study Indian philosophy as part of your philosophy degree.
The way the Lord works.
Yes. And so I went and I ended up doing my first degree in philosophy, it was called Philosophy and Religion, in the School of African and Asian Studies at the University of Sussex. And I specialised in Indian philosophy. And after that, I then went to Oxford and studied relevant Asian languages and became a specialist in Buddhist philosophy. I have a doctorate in Buddhist philosophy from Oxford.
It is fascinating when you think about how the places we end up in our journey, that the Lord uses those in so many different ways. And sometimes, even as John of the Cross kind of expresses that sometimes God backs away from you a little bit.
Yes.
And there you are. Now, let me ask you one question here before we go on, because is when you were studying philosophy there, did you get Aquinas? Did you get that whole background, or did you jump over it or skip it? Or?
Very interesting. In this country, and it's still the case in this country, people who study philosophy really don't study much medieval philosophy. However, I remember even way back before I went to university, I was at school in Canterbury, and I used to sit in the cloisters of Canterbury Cathedral trying to read Aquinas in my teens. And I've actually still got a book from those days, which I never then succeeded in reading. It's still on my bookshelf, and I haven't quite yet succeeded in reading it, but I'm getting round to it. I'm getting round to it. But so, yes, I mean, I find it terribly interesting you say it's amazing the way the Lord works, because I drifted away from Anglicanism. I no longer considered myself to be a Christian even. I was specialising in philosophy and specialising in Indian philosophy, and then moving over and specialising very much in Buddhist philosophy, and particularly Tibetan. And I became a Buddhist in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the same tradition as the Dalai Lama. I became a Buddhist in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition around about 1978. And I was then a Buddhist for about 20 years. And now, one might think, I mean, I think Christians might think, fellow Christians might think, I'm glad to say now, how tragic, how sad. You know, he drifted away from being a Christian and became a Buddhist for 20 years. I'm not so sure about that, actually. My feeling now, I may be wrong, but my feeling now is that if I'd remained an Anglican all those years, given the changes that have occurred in the Anglican Church over the last 20 years, I think by now I would probably be very, very uninvolved, lapsed, uninterested. What happened was that I gave up being a Christian, but I became very involved in religion and philosophy and in practicing as a Buddhist. As a Buddhist, I used to lead Buddhist retreats. I've taken part in radio and television programs as a Buddhist. I've dialogued publicly with Hans Kung, as I was a Buddhist dialoguing with Hans Kung. And it kept me interested, absorbed, until such time, I think, as the good Lord brought me back to the Christian faith. So I have no regrets about those years in which I was a Buddhist.
Well, there's that statement in 2 Corinthians, the opening part, that says that we are comforted that we might comfort others. God gives us experience that equips us to unique mission fields, which you have a gift that I can't talk to Buddhists or ex-Buddhists that you have in a very unique way. Now,
very much.
What were you looking for? Were you searching truth, searching meaning, were you direction in a positive or a negative sense? What was drawing you in those directions?
I wonder, what was I looking for in all those years when I was a Buddhist? I was looking, now I have to see what comes into my head. I was looking, first of all, for understanding, for truth. I remember, even when I was in my teens, walking along a street in the dark, saying to myself, what is true? What is the real meaning of everything? What is the final truth of things? And this is one point in which Buddhists and Christians have something in common. Both Buddhists and Christians agree that our final goal, our final fulfillment, what we were made for, if you like, although a Buddhist wouldn't say what we were made for, but put it that way, is to discover the final truth, final way things are. It's just that Buddhists and Christians completely disagree on what the final truth is. So I was looking for truth. Or how to define
between the many opinions, and we'll get to that later.
I was looking for truth. I was looking also, and this is tremendously important to me, I think, I was looking to deepen my own my own moral, my own moral stroke spiritual, but for me, morality is important. My own moral understanding. What is right? We have so many different forces, so many different influences on us saying this is right. Oh no, that's not right. This is right. That's wrong. Or oh no, that's not wrong. This is wrong. So on. How do I find what's right and what's wrong? After we've only got. I now think we've only got one life to find it out in. Of course, Buddhists believe in reincarnation. Yeah. That's different.
It's interesting in the way the Lord works, because this was not only a time in your own life, physical development in your late teens and early 20s, that's right?
Yep.
That you're going through this search, but our cultures are going through that search.
Yes.
The 60s and 70s, look at the craziness of it. It is interesting, that's the time of the Jesus people. A lot of people were searching and finding and seeking. I remember in my early college days, early 70s, there were young people exploring Buddhism, trying to find something they could hang their hat on, because they were presuming that everything that had been handed them was wrong.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, it very much was part of the time. I learned meditation. Actually, I originally learned meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi people. Of course, I was influenced by the fact the Beatles took up transcendental meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Some people might remember that.
Very popular.
Yes, and I used to enjoy burning incense. But having said that, we look now and we find that a little bit amusing. But actually, that was for us then real spiritual search, a real attempt to find out. Where I suppose, was a little bit different in that I didn't just do it in my spare time as a hobby. I took it up as a profession. I actually wanted to find out what Indian philosophy was about. I fell out with various Indian traditions because I found that the way they're presented in the West is simply distorted and superficial. So I really did go into this stuff, and I learnt the original language, and I've written a few books on Buddhist thought and so on. But I carried on searching. Actually, it's funny. People sometimes say to me, well, why did you become a Catholic? Let's put it this way. Why did you give up being a Buddhist? And one reason is that I couldn't meditate. I tried really hard for years and years and years. I even taught meditation, and I couldn't do it. I'm beginning to have doubts sometimes as to whether anyone can, really.
We're going to have our Buddhist audience will say, well, that's the reason. If he'd have meditated, he wouldn't become a Catholic.
Well, they might well say that. I don't have any problems with that, because, I've already had Buddhist friends.
Well, the reality is that from a Catholic perspective, meditation is a very important part of Catholic teaching of mystical theology.
Yes.
We sometimes get it mixed up with Eastern thought, but yet there are threads that are very similar. Now, my guess is that, like me, a lot of the audience listening don't know very much about Buddhist teaching and don't realize that in a certain sense it isn't a religion as we understand it. In our Western thought. So, one of the main questions to ask is, from a Buddhist perspective, you look back to your Buddhist days, where was God?
Yes, that is indeed the however many $1,000 question you said, a $20,000 question or whatever. Yes, perhaps it might help viewers to get this, to understand this point. Buddhism, in all its forms, there's no dispute about this, in all its forms, does not believe in God. Buddhism is a religion that does not believe in God. There are plenty of Buddhist texts that give arguments against the existence of God. In other words, against the existence of a creator, of an omniscient, omnipotent, good creator.
To whom we are responsible.
Yes. If we understand God as being the answer to why there is all this here, Buddhism does not hold that there is a God. Buddhism does not hold that we need an answer to the question, why is there all this here? Or at least, Buddhists don't hold that there's a final answer in the sense in which Christians hold that God is the final answer. So this is quite central. Buddhism, and I think this is one reason why a number of Westerners, including me perhaps, find Buddhism so attractive, is that if we have a problem with the idea of God, Buddhism is a religion which doesn't require God. So we can still be religious. We don't have to go off and give up all religion and become dreadful materialists or whatever. We can still be religious without needing to believe in God. So, sorry.
I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I need to talk about what you mean by religious then. If there's no God, but you may not want to go there yet, but we need to get there at some point.
Yeah, okay, no, I can go there now. There have been some people in the past who said that because Buddhism doesn't believe in God, it is not a religion. I personally have no particular problem with calling it a religion. There was, if, for example, someone was to produce a book of the major world religions, I would expect Buddhism to be in there. And, what's in a word? I don't see why Buddhism should be ruled out. However, if we define religion as having a god, then of course you would have to exclude Buddhism. And that's one reason why some people prefer to refer to Buddhism as maybe a form of psychotherapy or something like that. And I want to explain why that is. People may think, well, if Buddhism doesn't believe in God, what actually does Buddhism? What is Buddhism about? The answer is that Buddhists consider, in some respects it's quite simple, Buddhists consider that our problems, our suffering, our unhappiness comes from greed, hatred and delusion. In other words, Buddhists consider that it is something to do with our own minds that is why we actually suffer. We suffer because our minds are dominated by greed, hatred and delusion. Therefore, you reverse greed, hatred and delusion. So what's the opposite of greed, hatred and delusion? Let's say altruism, kindness and wisdom. You reverse that and all your suffering ends. End of it. That's the end of Buddhism. This is why Buddhism is all to do with meditation. Buddhism works on the mind to reverse greed, hatred and delusion. So Buddhism is, in that respect, all to do with transforming your mind, and that's why some people think it's a form of psychotherapy.
The ultimate trek to being an isolationist, in other words, very inward, very I don't use the word self-centered, that's kind of...
This is an interesting issue, and actually Buddhism we get onto some differences between different Buddhist traditions here. Some Buddhists would say that all Buddhists would agree that when you've transformed your mind, or that transforming your mind is your first important goal. Some Buddhists would say that when you've done that, you then, operating from a position of altruism, kindness and wisdom, you work to help others. This is a dispute within the Buddhist tradition. Either way, my own view here is that Buddhism finally becomes what I call a form of subjectivism. In other words, finally, its main concern, almost its total concern, is with my own mind. And therefore, Buddhism has no interest in God. It's only interested in one's own mind, one's own mental transformation. And to that extent, Buddhism, of course, is utterly different from Christianity. And there's something that I think can illustrate this quite well. If it turned out, it's not true, but supposing it did turn out to be true, that there was only my own mind in existence, supposing there was just only my own mind, as a Buddhist, I could still attain my goal. But for a Christian, of course, that would be quite impossible, because the goal of Christianity is not your own mind. The goal of Christianity is God, and God is utterly different from your own mind. God is nothing to do with your own subjective mental states. God's nothing to do with funny inner feelings. God is God. And also, in Christian terms, the goal is a communal thing. The goal is to do with the community of the church, the community of the saved, in the light of God. And this is utterly different from Buddhism.
What does Buddhism do with an afterlife?
Oh, Buddhists believe in an afterlife. Buddhists believe that there is reincarnation. And broadly speaking, therefore, when you die, you are reborn somewhere else. I mean, it's a very complicated matter.
Sure, I understand. But from a simplistic standpoint,
Buddhists believe in reincarnation. Incidentally, there's something that follows that's important there that people don't always realise, and that is that if reincarnation is true, then the actual person you are now in this life ceases to be very important, because you will have many more incarnations. There again, this is one reason why I think that no Orthodox Christian can possibly believe in reincarnation, because from a Christian point of view, the person you are is infinitely valuable. And so I know there are some Christians who seem to believe in reincarnation, but it cannot be.
Yeah. So in a sense, reincarnation, you're focused on my life, and then there's a next life, and
Yes.
So we're looking to the future, and we presume that I came from someone else. But does Buddhism deal with where this all started?
Yeah, the Buddhist tradition says that there was never a beginning. Going backwards, your previous incarnations are infinite.
Get away from the need for a creator.
Exactly. Your previous incarnations are infinite. Going backwards into the future, they may or may not be infinite, depending on whether you attain the goal of enlightenment, the cessation of greed, hatred and delusion. At which point, if you do, incarnations end.
Is it a good thing in Buddhism?
Well, Buddhists certainly think it's a jolly good thing, yes.
Okay, to stop this chain
Yes.
of...
Oh, yes. Yes.
okay.
Oh, yes. That
So
is the
they
goal.
believe
Yes.
being connected in this life is a negative.
Being in this life is finally, from a Buddhist point of view, negative. Yeah, I mean, this is, again, it's a little bit complicated, but I think all Buddhists would agree that in some sense or another, this world we're in now is not wanted.
See, the reason I wanted to go into this to a certain extent, because I know that, like you and I talked earlier, if we get too far into this, now we're into what you teach, and it can become very
no, you don't want
convoluted.
that. Oh, no,
We don't want to go there.
You don't want a university lecture.
But we know that we have folk that are watching who either have delved into this or who've lost family, friends, and children who've been drawn into this. And you mentioned earlier that there was this draw because of the peacefulness of it.
Yes.
And you can attain and have a discipline of religious life without a God to whom we are accountable.
Yes.
I mean, that is a very interesting slant to this.
I think you've put that absolutely right. I mean, I think that modern Westerners, young people, and not so young people like me, I think find Buddhism attractive, first of all, because it does away with various problematic things like God. Secondly, because they like Buddhist meditation, which gives one a feeling of calm, a feeling of gentleness, of tranquility. And they also are influenced by the statement that's often made, although it's a little bit misleading, but it's often made, that there's never been any wars or any violence associated with Buddhism. So what modern Westerners like, on the one hand, they like the fact it gets rid of various problems, it gets rid of God and so on. On the other hand, they also like the fact that it gives them wonderful, tranquil, calm feelings, feelings of harmony, feelings of love, feelings of kindness, and that sort of thing. And you can understand why people like that. What on earth that has got to do with the final purpose of our existence is another thing altogether. Bring God into this and everything changes.
That's right.
And that's what happened to me.
Okay, well, here you are a professor in this, and I would say respected in your field.
I jolly well hope so.
I mean, I'm not looking for to pat yourself on the back, but the point being, for our audience, is that you were recognized as to a certain authority, but not only authority on some other religion, but one that was your own, and very much a part of it. Yeah. Your students recognize that. Your family?
Yes. Oh, my family are most amusing in this. My daughter was actually brought up a Buddhist. She's the youngest. She's now 23. My two older boys were brought up without any religion. My wife was brought up as a Welsh Baptist, but she doesn't practice. She sees looking after me and my strange religious proclivities as being a sort of an occupational hazard, really, I think. She says she's got quite enough to deal with looking after me without religion as well. But what was nice was that when I was going through the conversion process, my family my brothers, my daughter and so on, would come up and ask me questions. And I would think about those questions and then write down my replies. And eventually that became another book. A good example of this is my daughter, who said to me, when I first told her that I was going to become a Catholic, I told her on telephone, she said, Dad, but you have to have faith to be a Catholic.
Interesting.
Please God, I do. And then she said, the next thing she said, she came to see me and she said, Dad, I think Buddhism is better than Catholicism. Why? And she said, well, because it gives our cat a chance through reincarnation. Because Buddhists believe that cats die and can be reincarnated as human beings. So that gave rise to a lot of thoughts, and my book on the subject has a section called Can Wensleydale Be Saved? Wensleydale is one of our cats. I should say for your North American viewers that Wensleydale is also the name of a British cheese.
Well, here you are in, like I said, recognized, published, and all the family, and you're on this trajectory. And I suppose the first stage of your trajectory then as a Buddhist is, what is it that first got you to believe, your daughter saying you have to have faith, to believe in God? What made that first hurdle?
Well, I think we've touched on some of these things, actually. I mean, Buddhists consider, and the Buddhist position is that we're in a state of suffering. There are various things you can do to overcome it. There are certain fundamental questions that Buddhists simply don't ask, or rather, they don't even consider they're important. Like, for example, and this is the question that was so important to me, why is there anything at all? Buddhists hold that there are things, and there are various laws, the famous law of karma, for example. If you do a wicked deed, a horrible thing will happen to you in the future. What Buddhists never actually answer is, why is it like that? Why are there things at all? This question actually comes from Aquinas, from St. Thomas Aquinas. And for me, that question became, there's a Buddhist term for this in Zen, it's a koan. It's a question which keeps niggling away at you. Why is there anything at all? Not why is there this table, presumably some carpenter made it, or why are there these books, or presumably your parents had something to do with making you and me. But not that, but why is it that there are things? Why is there anything at all? And no Buddhist tradition ever even asks that question, let alone answers it. And for me, and this is a very personal thing, for me, I don't think everyone needs to ask that question. Well, it would be good if they did, but but for me, that question became almost like an itch that wouldn't go away. Why is there anything? Why is there anything at all? And if you ask yourself that question, you either have to say there is no answer, which is what Buddhists say, and we don't even need to ask it, or you have to say there is an answer, and the answer there is to that question has to be something that fits with the definition of God. It has to be something about which you cannot then ask, why is there that? No one can ask. Actually, this occurs in Buddhist work sometimes. Buddhists actually say those who believe in God need to ask themselves the following question. If God is the cause of everything, what's the cause of God? Well, the answer to that is that they've completely misunderstood what God is. God is precisely the being for whom you cannot ask that question. So what the Buddhists can do is say there is no answer to the question. But if you do answer the question and you say there is God, the Buddhists cannot say back, and why is there God? That simply makes no sense.
This is funny in the sense of when we were talking, funny in the sense of you were talking about you went to this university and we're talking about how God brought you there, because what you're being drawn back to is the very philosophy that was ignored in that.
Yes.
We got Anselm,
we
have Aquinas, which
absolutely.
would have brought you to that way back when.
Yes, and would that they had. I think it's a crying shame that in an awful lot of the universities, at least in this country, students who study philosophy do not study Aquinas. They do not study medieval philosophy. In my own university, they do no medieval philosophy in the philosophy department. If any of their students express any interest in medieval philosophy, or Indian philosophy for that matter, they say to them, oh, there are some very strange sort of mad people in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, you better go and ask them. And they send them over to me.
So your story in a way at this point is you're doing this crossword puzzle and there's this piece that's missing and I'm not going to stop until I fill that hole.
Absolutely.
There's something wrong with that and it bugs you.
That's exactly
and you could have had it way back at that school back then, but again, that's part of the problem of our modern culture is they've thrown out all this underlying philosophy that was so important in the development of our civilization.
Absolutely. And you see, one of the things I've noticed becoming a Catholic in this country is that, having been a Buddhist for all those years, is that all of a sudden I see that I'm surrounded by as it were, remnants of my own faith. In this country we've got wonderful ruined abbeys, wonderful churches left from the Middle Ages, and all of a sudden I see all around me, this is one dimension of the way in which it feels like coming home. Of course it's a spiritual coming home too, but it's also a historical coming home. It's a coming home in so many different ways, and I now recognise that what I was looking for in all the work I did in Buddhist philosophy was really what I found in becoming a Catholic. But it took me some time to do it. And the first stage of that was God.
Well, here we're at that first stage. It might be a good place to take a break, and we'll come back in a moment, because that's the first thing I'm going to ask you. Okay, now you're back from Buddhism to God. One of my questions is, did that immediately cause you to leave Buddhism? Did you try to find a middle road where you could be a Buddhist with God? Did it take you to Christianity?
Okay.
Because there's lots of options there. So let's come back to that in just a moment. So stay with us, and we'll deal with that question in a second. Welcome back to the Journey Home. We're here again in the library at Littlemore, where John Henry Cardinal Newman spent his years kind of between his deeply committed work in the Oxford movement, renewing the Anglican Church, but in the process of that, released this tract 90 that set his life in disorder, and he was here trying to discern his direction. It was here that he wrote the essay on development of doctrine, and it was also here that he received in the Catholic Church. I'm here interviewing Professor Paul Williams. He's been talking about his journey of faith, Anglicanism first, but to Buddhism, and a professor of Buddhism, an author of Buddhism, and a well-respected authority on Buddhist philosophy. But as we just ended the first part of the program, he talked about making that first journey, that first step from Buddhism into a belief in the reality of God. I mean, that in itself changes so many different aspects. And look at science, look at the world, look at yourself, who you are and what you are.
Yes.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a Christian. I mean, where did you look at that point? Did you look back at your childhood faith?
Yeah. Okay, well, let's just take this in stages. First of all, I want to underline what you just said there about how coming to believe in God is radically reorienting. It really does. I mean, I think that people who have been brought up believing in God don't always realise what an incredible thing belief in God is, and how very different you are if you believe in God from the people who don't believe in God. And since Buddhism is a religion that doesn't believe in God, how very different you are from Buddhists, from the way Buddhists see things. And when I came to believe in God, and there were a number of stages in this, but when I finally came to believe in God, everything was reoriented. It's as if I was picked up and sort of shaken around and put back down again, and everything looks completely different. But you're absolutely right. Believing in God doesn't make you a Christian. After all, there are many religions in the world that believe in God that aren't Christianity. One thinks of Islam, for example, who Judaism. So if we look at this in terms of the logical stages of my journey, and I went through these different intellectual stages, though often they were all happening together, but basically I organised it in these different things. The next thing that really influenced me, given that I now believe that there's a God, and that therefore that God is and the God I've come to believe in, of course, is a God who cares and who loves and who is involved in the world and in history. Given that I came to believe in that God, the next stage of my journey was to say to myself, well, now which of the theistic religions do I follow? And what really influenced me next, I say funnily enough, because it might be a bit of a surprise to a lot of people, was actually the resurrection. I said, well, okay, God intervenes in the world. Where is God intervening in the world? And one has to face the fact that the resurrection, if it occurred, is utterly unique and astonishing. And I can say this, having studied all these Asian religions, there's nothing quite like the resurrection in Asian religions. And I have come to believe that if you look at the accounts of the resurrection, that a genuine bodily physical resurrection, by which I mean the tomb was empty, is the most reasonable explanation of what actually happened at that first Sunday. I know there are some, I'm sad to say, even some Christians who seem to think that there wasn't a genuine physical resurrection, that perhaps the resurrection was just a new spiritual understanding of the disciples, and presumably the tomb still had a body in it. But that's not what I've come to believe. When I came to believe that, until I have good evidence otherwise, that the resurrection definitely seems to be the most plausible account on any objective examination of the evidence, then it seemed to me most reasonable, if you're going through it in logical stages, to be a Christian. I don't want people to think that I, as it were, literally thought in these stages. In other words, I literally said, right, now I believe in God. Which religion shall I follow now? Shall I be able to? It wasn't quite like that. Of course, I think
a journey. How long a period do you think this?
Well, the journey was taking place over quite a number of years, but my organising my thoughts such that it became, as it were, a simple matter. God, resurrection, and the next stage was over quite a short period.
Okay.
I mean, that was the way in which I sidetracked all the different complicated issues that a lot of people think about when they're deciding whether to convert or not, and just focused on these points: God, resurrection, Christianity, Catholic Church.
Oh, I've got to stop here. To ask you a question, because I remember when I was at the stage between Protestantism and Catholicism, and these issues were coming into my mind in which I could no longer be a Protestant, but I still had a Protestant pulpit. And every time I got in that pulpit, I struggled with, now what am I going to say? You're still teaching Tibetan philosophy, but the things are changing inside. What was it doing to you in the midst of that?
Oh dear! Now,
especially belief in God.
Okay, let's answer this one again in stages. I mean, of course, for me, notice that although I was brought up as an Anglican, and I include Anglicanism under Protestantism, I've been away from that for so long that wasn't a problem for me. So the problem for me actually was twofold. I'd come to believe in God. And I was beginning to convince myself of the resurrection, while at the same time I was academically teaching in Buddhist studies and also still teaching Buddhism in a Buddhist centre. Now, those are not the same thing. At least in this country, university departments of theology and religious studies are secular university departments. We don't have any Catholic universities.
You're not teaching people to believe.
We're not teaching people to believe. We're teaching people the academic study of religion. So the quick answer would be that there was no problem me carrying on, and I do carry on, teaching Buddhist studies as I always had, teaching them from the other books I've written, and so on. Now that's a quick answer. As a matter of fact, it's not actually that simple, because I tend to get very involved in what I'm teaching. And if I'm not any more involved in what I'm teaching, then I begin to lose interest a bit. So I think probably my actual teaching has changed. But that's a different issue. Now, coming to the other side of it, the point about how could I still teach Buddhism in a Buddhist centre? Well, the answer is I didn't. I remember the very last weekend course I taught in a Buddhist centre. It was on some very knotty areas of Buddhist philosophy in which I specialise. And I actually ended my very last teaching in a Buddhist centre by raising the question for all the audience, all the people taking part, why is there something rather than nothing? I said, look, Buddhism has always emphasised that it's very rational, and Buddhists actually like asking questions and investigating them. Buddhists and Western Buddhists are so proud of the fact that they think they're so much more rational and more clever than Christians. And I said, look, we've done all this Buddhist philosophy, but there's this question left. Why is there something rather than nothing? And with that, I finished. And I left it with them.
Very interesting. It had to be. That's what I'm saying. You're hearing this thing, if it's that radical a change from Buddhism to belief in God to the resurrection, it had to be hitting you in very personal ways in what you're teaching, family, other things, or were you keeping this inward?
No, I tend to be I tend to be a very private person. I mean, I don't. If I do give these things out, as it were, they go into my writing. I mean, the book I wrote on my conversion has got all this in. But otherwise, I tend to be very private. Well, unless I've had a glass of wine or two, in which case I'm not. But so I wasn't really talking to my family about this sort of thing. I mean, I think a lot, but wasn't really talking about it. But yes, I think there was, obviously there was a lot going on inside. I think I want to say this too. I think that there was a part of me, let's put it in two different ways. I think there was a part of me that was wanting to come back to the church. That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is that there was a part of me on which grace was directly working. So on the one hand, there's various philosophical and theological intellectual thoughts going on, but driving all this is something at a level down inside, which is partly, I mean, if I try to isolate it, it's partly my own real want, and partly the Holy Spirit is leading one on.
But we don't want to go here because this one thing, but it just came to my mind that there is certainly one element that isn't in Buddhism. It's this concept of grace.
Yes. You're absolutely right. Yep, not there.
There's nothing like that, right? In any concept of Buddhism.
Not there. Not there. Grace, the grace of God cannot be there.
Yeah. I mean, so they were alone. No. So a Buddhist is essentially alone in this universe without a beginning, and where's the end?
Yes, absolutely. And Buddhism places an enormous emphasis on one's own doing it. And I know that. One book I read on Buddhism had this whole chapter which was Total Responsibility in Theory and Practice, this chapter was called, which is really what it's all about in Buddhism. Now, of course, a lot of Westerners actually find that very attractive. They like the fact that Buddhism doesn't have a God and that Buddhism is placing emphasis on you. The Buddha is supposed to have said, basically, it's up to you. Seek out your own salvation with diligence. It's supposed to have been his last words. The problem is, now I'm speaking from my own experience, having tried this for 20, 30 years, I'm not actually a very good practitioner. I was, okay, if it's up to me, I was making a horrible mess of it. And don't forget...
It almost sounds like Paul in Romans 7.
Exactly. Oh, yes, absolutely. I think this is... And now, you see, what a Buddhist would say back is, yes, in this life, we often make a mess of it, but there are many future lives. Now, I was very influenced by that because the more I thought about rebirth, the more I thought, yes, but if I die now and I'm reborn, it won't be me. So what Buddhism is effectively saying is, look, Williams, if you can't practice, bad luck, you've had it. There might be another person who's your reincarnation, but it won't be you. Because obviously, if I suddenly die and I'm reborn in the United States as a I don't know, in the United States as a southern football player or something, we can't. It might be the reincarnation of Williams, but it certainly won't be Williams.
And no memory in between.
And so there's no memory in between, and so I've had it.
You've made this journey to God, accepting the resurrection, so you're at least Christian. There's a lot of Christian traditions. What brought you to the Catholic Church?
And then we hit the really tricky one. Incidentally, I could have accepted the resurrection and not been a Christian. There are some Jews that accept the resurrection. But for me, it seemed most reasonable, accepting the resurrection, to be a Christian. That doesn't seem a problem. What made me a Catholic? Now here, we hit an interesting issue, because I suspect that people are going to expect me now to, as it were, go through the various things that make me a Catholic. But actually, my argument now is a reverse one. My argument now is that I became a Catholic... let's say the structure of the argument is that having decided to become a Christian, I needed a very, very good argument not to be a Roman Catholic. And the reason for this, put in a nutshell, is that actually I'm influenced by my Buddhism here. Buddhism talks about what it calls the lineage. The lineage is the tradition of teachers going back in history, right back to the founder of the religion, in the case of Buddhism, the Buddha. So now what I want to argue is that Catholicism has the lineage. It simply goes back to our Lord and to Peter. So, right, okay, now some people might not agree with me there, but let's just take that. Now, what I'm then saying is this. Given that Catholicism has the lineage, if one is not to be a Catholic, one needs an extremely strong argument that will offset all the argument for the historicity and the ancientness of the Catholic Church. Now, various friends and family gave me arguments, but I didn't find them convincing. For example, some people said, the late medieval church was corrupt, wasn't it? And therefore, being a Catholic is to follow what was a church that had become completely corrupt. Not convincing to me. First of all, because historical research has now shown, the work of Eamon Duffy, for example, has shown that the late medieval church was not corrupt. Well, of course, it was a little bit. It certainly had corruption.
There were corrupt leaders
all human organisations are corrupt. But what we would have to argue for that argument to work is that the late medieval church was so corrupt that it had to be overthrown by the Reformation in order to establish the true church, in other words, the Reformed Church. And if you remember that the Reformation involved a lot of killing, a lot of horrible things happening, what we would have to say is that nevertheless, the late medieval church was so corrupt that God's plan was to bring about the Reformed churches in order to, in order to put his plan back online. Now that argument, some might find it attractive, certainly didn't seem a strong one to me. Likewise, some people said to me, but what about contraception? Surely that's a good argument not to be a Catholic. Well, not for me, I'm afraid. I talk about this in my book. The idea that supposing I thought contraception was a good thing, even that wouldn't be enough of an argument for me not to be a Catholic. As a matter of fact, I think I entirely hold the views of the church on contraception. Virgin birth, I don't know why people have a problem with the virgin birth. It seems to me God can do anything, and the virgin birth seems perfectly possible for him to do. The position of the papacy. Some people said to me, but surely, the papacy authority. Quite the reverse. I actually, because I'm so totally aware of my own failings and my own incapacities, I need a church that is confident of where it's going and that is clear about what it teaches. And so for me, the people who said to me, but surely, the issue of authority in the church is enough to make you not be a Catholic. Actually, it's exact reverse. The issue of authority in the church is precisely one of the things that made me a Catholic. So a lot of the things that people consider are good reasons for not being Catholics, to me, were actually not good reasons for not being Catholics, and sometimes were actually good reasons for being Catholics. But I want to get back to the main thread here. The main thread all the time was not, are there arguments for not being Catholic? The main thread was, are the arguments for not being Catholic so strong that you wouldn't be a Catholic, but you would follow one of the Reformed churches or the Eastern Orthodox Church or one of those things, and in doing that hold that they were what God had intended all along. And that simply does not seem to me plausible.
Especially if you're drawn to the lineage idea, which in the early church, when they wanted to determine whether a particular teaching was true, they would say, can this be traced back to a church of an apostle?
Yes, yes.
There just aren't that many churches today that have any source of lineage.
Absolutely.
Going back very far. There's only a select few that might even have any claim to that whatsoever.
Absolutely. I have to say that the only other Christian church that might have attracted me would have been Eastern Orthodoxy. But I still think that the issue of authority is a problem for the Eastern Orthodox Church. I think that we have to remember that if we are to be Christians, we have to remember that Christianity, and I'm sorry to say this to my North American friends, Christianity is not a democracy. And democracy is a fairly recent development, and the Christian church is a theocracy. And the only issue for us as Christians is, how do we know what God is telling us? How do we know what where the Holy Spirit is leading us? And if you look at it in that light, then we've got very few alternatives. There are traditions that would say we know what God is telling us by reading the Bible. Problem with that is twofold. First of all, you have to interpret the Bible, and even Luther and Calvin wanted to say it was only their interpretations that count. I've forgotten what the other one was. But I mean, So you've got to interpret the Bible anyway. And what other alternatives? You've got the idea that we can all get together, like the Anglican Synod, we can all get together and discuss and vote and pray a lot. But even then, in the last analysis, it's coming back to hoping you've got it right.
And it comes back to politics. And who has the most preference within that little group of folk? Now you're Catholic, still teaching in the professorship there. In what ways has being a Catholic changed your understanding of religion? We talked about before a religious practice. Now we have a religious practice. How has it affected your understanding of your own walk with the Lord?
Absolutely. Absolutely wonderful. People often think, Christians who know that I was a Buddhist for those years, often think that I must be interested, my own Christian practice must be mainly interested in things like meditation and Christian meditation, and still sitting cross-legged as a Buddhist and sort of reciting prayers or whatever. Absolutely not. For me, the centre of my life is the Mass. And the Mass to me is the most amazing experience. I sometimes hear that there are Christians, Catholics, who find the Mass boring. I cannot believe it. I have to say I'm very lucky because I go to Clifton Cathedral here in the UK, and we do have an extremely good choir, and the liturgy is done very well. So I have to say I do feel for those who don't have good choirs. The liturgy is not done well. But for me, the Mass is heaven on earth. And for me, the nearest one is ever going to get to in this life, to God in this life, is in the Mass. And I think we really have to realise this. That was always how it was intended. That is actually, when we say that God is on earth in the Mass, that Christ is with us in the Mass, this isn't just some funny way in which we speak, We really do believe that. I really believe that. This is the teaching of the Church. And if one doesn't properly take on board what that amounts to, then, who am I to say it? But then, in a sense, I think one doesn't really quite understand what believing this is. I sometimes find people in Mass who are looking around and looking out, they're hoping the thing will be. Don't they realise God is there? Where else are they going to find God? You're not going to find God sitting in meditation. What you find sitting in meditation, actually, are a lot of distracting thoughts and occasionally some very nice, sort of warm inner feelings. I've got nothing against warm inner feelings. Let's all have more warm inner feelings. But that's not God, and it's not what religion is about.
What a journey from Buddhism, in which you have religion without a God, to believing in God, to believing that you receive God on your tongue, the reality of your Creator. I imagine that's why some of your friends thought you were out of your mind.
Oh,
right?
absolutely, yes. And I liked being thought to be out of my mind, because you see, I think the church from the beginning was thought to be out of its mind. You remember St. Paul talking about foolishness to the Greeks? And I think that nowadays, far too many people in the church, in the Catholic Church, seem to think the church should be popular. We need to take on board the fact that the church never was, if you like, popular, by which I mean it never taught what people would expect. And incidentally, that's a point where Catholicism is similar to Buddhism. The Buddha himself is supposed to have said, soon after his enlightenment, what I teach is not what people would expect. It goes against the current, he said. So there, Buddhism and Christianity have that thing in common. Both think that the truth is something which will not be appreciated by people, will not be understood. I find it rather sad, actually, when I see people in the church getting terribly worried about the idea that the church should move with the times and should adapt to what people would expect. As a general rule of thumb, I suspect that if what you're saying is what people would expect, you've probably got it wrong.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because where we sit is not all that far from where Father Edmund Campion was betrayed and captured over in Lyford Grange, taken into London, and was tried to force to confirm what the common view was being forced on everyone, and he would not do that and suffered his martyrdom for that. But one of the questions that come to my mind here as we're drawing to a close is, I'm sure there are viewers who have had family and friends who've been drawn away into that. First of all, any words of advice to them to help bring them back or protect them from this?
Okay, yes, I mean, I've quite a lot of words of advice, but let me put it very simply. First of all, if your children or your family or friends become Buddhists, do not worry. Buddhism is not a strange cult. Buddhism is actually a very ancient religion that goes back actually to well into BC. There are a lot of very good Buddhist teachers around. There are some who aren't so good, but generally speaking, Buddhism is a respectable world religion. It's not a cult. It doesn't believe in God. It's not Christianity. Don't get it confused. Don't get it mixed up. Make sure your family are aware, I mean, the people who have become Buddhists, that they are aware that they cannot be Buddhists and Christians.
I was wondering, because we've got to be careful that we don't imply a form of indifferentism, that it doesn't matter, though.
No. Well, what I was going to say is that what they need to be clear about is that they have made a choice. And in choosing to be Buddhists, they are choosing not to be Christians. But they may well come back. This may well be the way that the Holy Spirit keeps them interested, as happened with me. Actually, one other thing I could say is that well, I've written a book on the subject.
Sure, fine,
My book, The Unexpected Way, which is a combination of my own spiritual story. I even throw in a few prayers, including a prayer for getting bargains in the sales, in the after Christmas sales. It includes my own story, and also includes the points where I think the points where a Christian can give the Buddhist questions to consider. I think that if a member of your family has become a Buddhist, you should respect that, but you should suggest they might like to read my book. If they can answer back, if they can reply, all well and good.
Well, that's it. In a few moments, in fact, we're going to be taping a bookmarks with Doug Keck about your book, so you can talk more in detail about that, because I think this is a really key issue, that there are people in America that don't know what to do with Buddhism, because it's gone through its stages in America with the interest in the 70s and 80s and still around. And sadly, there are Catholic retreat centers that have blindly bought into some of this stuff.
That's what does worry me, you see, and this is why it's not indifferentism. I mean, what does actually worry me is not Christians who become Buddhists. It's Christian organizations who do not make it clear that Christianity and Buddhism are quite different. I think a Christian who becomes a Buddhist has to realize that they are no longer a Christian. For me, an essential point in my book actually was that I realized that I had to make a choice. In the last analysis, you have to make a choice. And it's in the last analysis, it was quite simple. I mean, I remember thinking to myself, look, if someone said to me, you were going to die tomorrow, what would you do? And I thought, well, first of all, I'd panic. But secondly, I thought to myself, I'd ask to be received into the Catholic Church. In the last analysis, if someone said to me, you remember that terribly sad story of the girl who was, this was in the States, someone pointed a gun at her head and said, do you believe in God? In the last analysis, if someone pointed a gun to me and said, do I believe in God? I mean, I do say this in the book, I could not say no. I would have to say yes. And I do think, finally, we all have to imagine that we're in that situation with a gun pointing at our head. It's not quite like that, of course, because if your child has become a Buddhist now, in other words, they said no to God, they may later on, say
never
yes.
know how the Lord
But
might use that.
yeah, exactly. We all need to imagine now that we've got a gun pointing at our head. And if we've got a gun pointing at our head, do you believe in God or don't you? And if you are a Buddhist, you cannot say you believe in God. You have to say, no, you don't believe in God. Am I willing to say, no, I don't believe in God? Gun pointing at my head, I have to say, yes, I do believe in God. I mean, that was tremendously important to me.
But it's interesting you say that, because here we are in England, the land of martyrs. I mean,
Yes.
many martyrs who had to take a stand for that.
Absolutely.
Professor Williams, thank you very
Great
much for
pleasure.
sharing your journey. And I do believe that God gives us experiences in life to prepare us for mission fields. And so our prayers are for you in this wonderful mission, reaching those who have been drawn out of the Catholic faith and need to help them bring them home. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank you for joining us on this special edition of The Journey Home. I look forward to being with you again very soon. God bless.